Single men are often treated like unfinished projects, as if a man standing alone must be in repair, missing a part, waiting for someone else to complete him. The implication is subtle but constant. If you don't have a partner, something must be wrong with you. You're behind. You're avoiding something. You're immature. You're emotionally unavailable. That story is convenient. It's also often wrong. Plenty of men aren't single because they were rejected. They're single because they watched closely, lived through enough, and finally understood the trade-offs that get romanticized and never itemized. They learned the difference between companionship that strengthens you and connection that slowly drains you. They recognized how quickly love can become endless negotiation, how easily communication can become constant management, and how often a man's mission gets treated like a hobby that should be paused whenever someone else feels unsettled. A man's solitude is not automatically a failure. Sometimes it's a verdict. Sometimes it's wisdom. Sometimes it's a decision made after experience. Being alone doesn't weaken a man. Avoiding himself does. A man who chooses solitude after living a little is not lacking connection. He's refusing distraction. He's not terrified of intimacy. He's rejecting imbalance. He's not declaring war on women. And he's not denying the value of love. He's just unwilling to trade his direction for approval. He's unwilling to shrink so someone else can feel secure. And that is an important distinction because the moment we stop treating singleness as a social defect, we can finally talk about it honestly. Intentional singleness is not an empty gap to be filled. It is a position some men take deliberately after noticing what many relationships quietly demand from them. Let's dismantle the misunderstanding properly. For years, men have been told that partnership is proof of maturity, that settling down means you've grown up. And of course, healthy relationships can be a sign of growth. A good partner can sharpen you, support you, challenge you, and help you build a life that is bigger than what you would build alone. But what rarely gets examined is the other reality. Many modern relationships don't operate like partnerships. They operate like emotional economies. The man provides stability, attention, reassurance, availability, and often money, while also being expected to remain ambitious, driven, strong, and consistent. He's expected to be a rock, but also a therapist, a provider, but also a constant presence, disciplined, but also endlessly accommodating, focused, but never too focused, independent, but never too independent. And the pressure is rarely stated plainly. It's delivered through tone, through expectations, through what becomes a problem only when he prioritizes his work, his training, his goals, his silence, his solitude, through the subtle message that if he were more loving, more mature, more emotionally intelligent, he would make space constant space no matter what it costs him. To be clear, this isn't women are bad. This is not an attack. Women aren't a single personality type, and neither are men. Plenty of women genuinely support a man's purpose and understand that love does not require possession. Plenty of relationships are balanced, mature, and built on mutual respect. But patterns exist, and men notice them. They feel them in their bones. They experience the slow drift from I love you to why aren't you more available? They experience the tension between long-term ambition and short-term emotional expectations. They experience the way some relationships reward a man for being strong until his strength is not centered around the relationship. Then his focus becomes a threat. Over time, some men notice something that changes everything. Being in a relationship does not automatically equal growth. In many cases, it slows it down. Not always through major conflict, but through constant small compromises that never get counted as sacrifices. 1,000 tiny interruptions, 1,000 tiny justifications, 1,000 tiny moments where he has to explain himself, soften his drive, dilute his standards, and make his mission feel negotiable. Choosing to remain single after recognizing that is not bitterness, it's clarity. It's the refusal to confuse companionship with purpose. A man who stands alone is not empty. He's refusing to betray himself daily just to keep someone else comfortable. This reframing matters because once singleness is seen as a conscious choice rather than a social failure, everything else changes. Time, energy, focus, and identity stop leaking outward. They start consolidating inward. And that consolidation is where the shift begins. It starts with time. When a man chooses to remain single with intention, the first thing that returns is time, not free time, in the lazy sense, but undisturbed time. Time that doesn't require constant explanation. Time that doesn't have to be negotiated. Time that isn't constantly reshaped to fit someone else's emotional schedule. In many relationships, a man's hours are never fully his. His attention is open to interruption. His priorities are subject to questioning. His weekend isn't just a weekend. It's a series of social decisions he's expected to co-sign. His evenings aren't just evenings. They're a test of how available he is. Even his quiet becomes suspicious. What's wrong? Why are you being distant? Why are you so focused? Do you even care? Sometimes those questions come from real insecurity. Sometimes from genuine desire for connection. And sometimes from a need for control disguised as closeness. The result is the same. A man's time becomes something he must manage around someone else's reactions. A single man does not have to bargain with his goals. There's no subtle guilt for choosing discipline over spontaneity. No quiet punishment for choosing work over conversation. No tension for choosing training over social plans. He can be fully immersed in what he's building without constantly proving that his ambition is still love. And this is where men discover truth that rarely gets said out loud. The strongest seasons of male growth often happen in silence. Careers accelerate when you can concentrate. Bodies change when training is consistent. Skills compound when they're practiced daily without apology. The best versions of men are often built in stretches of life where there is no constant emotional friction. That isn't because relationships are inherently bad. It's because growth demands delayed gratification, and many relationships demand immediate responsiveness. Those two don't always coexist peacefully. A man who has experienced this knows what it's like to wake up and move through a day with a single direction. No constant background pressure, no emotional weather system to navigate, no negotiating the price of his focus. His time becomes linear, again, directed, strategic. And this is not about avoiding responsibility. It's about choosing the right responsibility. Men are often taught that sacrificing their time is proof of love. Few are taught that protecting their time is proof of self-respect. When a man gives his time away too easily, he signals without meaning to that his mission is optional. When he guards it, he communicates that his direction matters. That's why solitude often looks selfish to outsiders, especially to people who benefited from his availability. But from the inside, it feels like coherence. Life stops reacting and starts advancing. And once a man experiences what disciplined, undisturbed time can produce, he becomes far less willing to surrender it casually, especially for relationships that offer comfort, but demand stagnation. Now, once time comes back, something deeper begins to happen. Because when a man is alone, there is no one left to lean on emotionally but himself. In many relationships, men are quietly trained to outsource emotional regulation. When tension rises, they look for soothing. When confidence drops, they wait for reassurance. When uncertainty appears, they want someone to stabilize them. At first, this looks like opening up, and healthy vulnerability is good. Men should be able to express themselves. Men should have emotional range. Men should be able to talk. But there's a line between healthy vulnerability and dependence, and a lot of men cross that line without realizing it, not because they are weak, but because the relationship dynamic subtly encourages it. Here's the paradox men learn the hard way. Some partners say they want you to be open, but lose respect when you are. Some partners invite vulnerability and then treat it like a liability later. Some partners create a space where you become emotionally reliant and then resent you for needing that space. Again, not all women, not all relationships, but enough men experience this pattern that it becomes a lesson. If your emotional stability depends on someone else's approval, you can be controlled. Single men lose the safety net immediately. No one is there to absorb frustration. No one is there to manage moods. No one is there to distract them from discomfort. At first, this can feel like exposure. But exposure is not damage. Exposure is training, loneliness, restlessness, self-doubt, the empty silence after a long day, the weekend with no plans, the moment you realize you have no one to lean on when you're tired. These things don't destroy a man. They refine him if he doesn't run from them. Solitude forces a man to confront what he usually avoids. He learns to sit with discomfort instead of numbing it. He learns the difference between genuine loneliness and simple boredom. He learns that not every uneasy feeling needs immediate relief. He learns to stop mistaking attention for love. This process is not comfortable, but it produces something rare: emotional autonomy. A man who can regulate his inner world without external validation becomes extremely difficult to manipulate. He doesn't panic when someone is distant. He doesn't chase reassurance. He doesn't over-explain himself. He can remain calm under pressure because his stability is not rented from someone else's mood. This is where single men are often misread. People assume emotional independence equals emotional coldness. In reality, it can be the opposite. A man who no longer needs emotional rescue can finally engage without desperation. He can listen without begging to be understood. He can be present without losing himself. And once emotional autonomy develops, something else happens. Mental energy returns. Most men underestimate how much mental energy is drained by the wrong relationship, not only through big fights, but through constant low-level noise. The need to explain decisions, the obligation to reassure, the silent monitoring of someone else's mood, the effort of staying safe in conversation, the constant translating of your natural self into something more acceptable. Over time, that background interference erodes clarity. Focus becomes fragmented. Decisions feel heavier than they should. Peace becomes conditional. When a man lives single by design, that noise fades. Not because life becomes easy, but because unnecessary layers are removed. He no longer has to justify every choice. He no longer adjusts his tone to prevent a reaction. He no longer carries the job of maintaining someone else's inner balance. What some people call communication often becomes ongoing emotional management, and it is mentally expensive. In solitude, attention returns to its natural state: directed, sustained, undivided. The mind becomes quiet but not empty. There is space to think fully without interruption or second guessing. Problems are approached directly instead of being filtered through how they might be received. Decisions sharpen because they are made for outcomes, not approval. This is where peace is misunderstood. Peace is not the absence of emotion. Peace is the absence of interference. Many men realize, often too late, that what exhausted them wasn't their ambition, their discipline, or their work. It was the emotional clutter of constantly trying to remain understood, constantly trying to keep the relationship atmosphere comfortable, constantly trying to predict and manage reactions. Sometimes a man's withdrawal isn't apathy, it's recovery. Recovery from overstimulation, recovery from constant justification, recovery from being expected to prioritize harmony over clarity. Once that recovery begins, he sees patterns faster. He recognizes manipulation sooner. He makes decisions without overthinking how they will be perceived. He stops mistaking emotional intensity for meaning. And because his inner space is no longer crowded, he becomes harder to rush, guilt, or pressure into choices that don't serve him. This is why some people feel unsettled around men who are comfortably single. There is nothing to hook into. No reactive loops, no overexposure, no bargaining through emotion, just presence, restraint, direction. When a man experiences what an unpolluted mental space feels like, he starts guarding it carefully, especially from relationships that demand access without offering stability in return. With clarity restored, another shift follows. Resources stop being spent to impress and start being used to build. One of the quiet advantages of intentional singleness is financial honesty. When a man isn't in a relationship, money stops being emotional currency. There's no pressure to perform generosity on demand, no expectation to prove worth through spending, no subtle tests disguised as experiences, no lifestyle inflation because someone else's standards become your new baseline. Let's speak plainly. In many dating dynamics, a man's financial output becomes part of his attractiveness. His ability to provide is observed, evaluated, and compared often without being openly acknowledged. Women don't always intend it as pressure. Sometimes it's just what they're used to. But men feel it immediately. Dates, trips, gifts, constant spending to signal investment. The message is rarely spoken, but it's understood. If you value her, you will spend. If you don't spend, you must not value her. If you hesitate, you're not serious. Over time, money stops functioning as a tool and starts functioning as validation. And that's where men lose leverage over their own future, not through irresponsibility, but through compliance. Single men step out of that arena. There's no audience to impress, no emotional reward tied to expenditure. Money becomes neutral again, strategic, directed. Instead of being used to maintain attraction, it can be invested into education, assets, health, business, skills, relocation, long-term stability. The focus shifts from short-term pleasure to durable advantage, and that shift compounds. This is not about being cheap. This is about being intentional. A man who controls his finances controls his options. He can relocate, retrain, invest, take calculated risks, build a foundation. He is not anchored by expectations he didn't design. Some people interpret financial restraint as a lack of generosity, but restraint is often foresight. Relationships can encourage financial leakage in the name of romance while long-term planning gets postponed. Men are praised for sacrifice, not strategy. Yet when the relationship ends, the sunk costs remain with the man and the lessons arrive late. Solitude interrupts that cycle. It forces a man to look directly at his numbers without emotional distortion. What he earns, what he wastes, what he could build. No one to blame, no one to impress. Just choices and consequences. That honesty can be uncomfortable, but it is empowering. Because when money is no longer used to purchase approval, it becomes what it was always meant to be: a foundation, not a performance. And once a man has time, emotional autonomy, mental clarity, and financial control, the most confronting phase begins: being alone with nothing left to distract him from who he really is. When a man is truly alone, the noise stops, and whatever remains becomes impossible to ignore. There is no partner to distract him from his weaknesses, no relationship drama to externalize his frustration, no constant interaction to blur his self perception. This is the stage most people avoid, not because it is harmful, but because it is honest. In solitude, a man sees himself clearly: his discipline or lack of it, his confidence or the gaps in it, his ambition and the excuses he's used to delay it. Without someone absorbing his attention, there is nothing to mask inconsistency. This exposure is not gentle, it is not comforting, but it is necessary. A lot of men bounce from relationship to relationship to avoid this confrontation. They stay busy with talking stages, situationships, casual intimacy, constant messages, constant stimulation. Not always because they're bad men. Often because quiet feels like failure when you haven't learned to live with yourself. But a man who stays in that cycle never builds an internal anchor. He keeps outsourcing parts of himself to the presence of someone else. He never fully faces his fears because something is always there to soften them. In the long run, that avoidance becomes dependence. Being alone removes the escape hatch. A man is forced to sit with discomfort instead of outrunning it. He must confront the parts of himself that crave approval, fear, silence, and equate attention with worth. This is not about self-hatred. It's about self-definition. Identity forms under pressure, not reassurance. Character is built through endurance, not applause. A man who can tolerate his own company without numbing it with entertainment, overwork, or constant validation develops a rare form of stability. He's no longer afraid of quiet. He no longer needs constant stimulation to feel alive. From the outside, people may mislabel this as detachment, but it's often integration. It's a man assembling himself into something coherent. And once coherence is achieved, dependence loses its grip. He doesn't need a relationship to feel complete because he has already faced the parts of himself that many people try to outsource to others. This is the dividing line. A man who cannot endure solitude will attach to anything, something just to feel safe. A man who can endure it emerges with an internal anchor, and from that anchor, he can choose connection without needing it to survive. That brings us to the accusation often thrown at men who choose solitude, that they are running away, running from commitment, running from intimacy, running from women. It's a convenient assumption, especially for those who benefit from a man's availability, but it's not accurate. Intentional singleness is not a retreat, it's a recalibration. A man who steps away from relationships after experience is not rejecting connection. He is rejecting imbalance. He has seen what happens when desire overrides self-respect, when companionship demands self-erasure, when peace is traded for proximity, when he becomes a version of himself that is easier to be with, but harder to respect. Choosing to be alone is how he resets his standards internally first. Avoidance is driven by fear. Preparation is driven by clarity. A man who isolates to rebuild is not hiding. He is strengthening the parts of himself that relationships can exploit when they are weak. His boundaries become firmer. His expectations become cleaner. Neediness dissolves because it is no longer fed, And when this man eventually enters a relationship, his posture is different. He doesn't seek completion. He doesn't overinvest early. He doesn't confuse attention with intimacy. He doesn't tolerate dynamics that require him to shrink. Some women will be drawn to that. Some will respect it immediately. Some will feel challenged by it. Because a man who does not chase, does not over-explain, and does not fear, walking away disrupts common power dynamics. He cannot be motivated by withdrawal or guilt. His interest is present but not desperate. And because his life already functions without a relationship, he engages by choice, not necessity. People sometimes mistake this for emotional distance, but what it often is emotional self-possession. He can care without losing direction. He can commit without surrendering identity. That balance is not something you fake. It is built, usually in solitude. Singleness, in this sense, becomes a filter. It removes the urge to attach prematurely. It exposes which connections are additive and which are parasitic. It ensures that if a man chooses partnership, it enhances his life rather than replacing it. So, what is the point of this whole argument? It's not to glorify being single as if relationships are traps. It's to restore the dignity of male solitude, because too many men are shamed for protecting their peace, their focus, and their mission. At this point, the pattern should be clear. Intentional singleness is not about what a man lacks. It's about what he regains. Time stops being fragmented. Emotions stop being outsourced. Mental energy stops leaking. Money returns to its proper function. Identity solidifies under pressure instead of being diluted by expectation. What emerges is not isolation. It is authority over your own life. And this is precisely why the narrative around single men can be aggressively negative. A man who stands alone is hard to influence. He can't be rushed by fear of abandonment. He can't be shamed into compliance by the threat of loneliness. He can't be bought with attention or pacified with approval. He doesn't move because someone is upset. He moves because something is true. That kind of man forces the world to deal with him honestly. And honesty is uncomfortable in a culture that often rewards performance over principle. Now, let me say something that matters, especially if this speech is aimed at men. None of this absolves men of accountability. Some men aren't single by choice. They're single because they avoid growth, because they refuse responsibility, because they want the benefits of love without the discipline of loyalty, because they confuse standards with entitlement, because they want a woman to adapt to them while they refuse to improve. That isn't intentional singleness. That's stagnation with an excuse. Real intention looks like work. If you're going to stand alone with purpose, not as an escape, but as a proving ground. Use the time to build discipline, build health, build competence, build emotional control, build financial strength, build skills, build friendships, build a life that has weight and structure. Because the goal isn't to become a man who doesn't need anyone in the arrogant sense. The goal is to become a man who doesn't need anyone to avoid himself. Then, if you choose love, you choose it from strength. And that is the final clarification. Intentional singleness is not the rejection of relationships. It's the preparation to enter them without losing ground. A man who has built himself in solitude doesn't treat relationships like emotional life rafts. He treats them like alliances. He walks toward connection, not because he fears being alone, but because he respects what companionship can add when it is healthy. He knows the difference between love and possession. He knows the difference between intimacy and control. He knows the difference between communication and constant negotiation. He knows the difference between sacrifice that is noble and sacrifice that is self erasure. He knows the difference between compromise and surrender. And because he knows those differences, he can love without disappearing. So the question isn't, why is he single? The real question is he single by accident or by design? Because a man who is single by accident is often drifting. He's reacting. He's waiting to be chosen or waiting for life to happen. But a man who is single by design is building. He is not empty. He is focused. He is not immature. He is disciplined. He is not afraid of intimacy. He is unwilling to trade his identity for access. He is not lonely. He is selective. And that selectiveness is not cruelty. It is self-respect. Let the world misunderstand if it wants. A man doesn't need to explain his standards to people who only respected him when he was easy to access. If your peace requires explanation to be tolerated, it was never peace. It was permission. If your purpose must be negotiated to be accepted, it was never partnership. It was management. If your growth must be slowed to keep someone comfortable, it was never love. It was dependency. A man who has learned to stand alone will not fear walking with someone. He will simply refuse to walk with someone who expects him to crawl. That is the point. Not isolation, not bitterness, not ego, but wholeness. Because a man who can endure solitude without collapsing into distraction becomes a man who can enter love without losing himself. And that man is not unfinished. He's built